The Mumbles Lifeboat Disaster of 1883. An in-depth account of this disaster has been published by Kate Jones, and is viewable on a History of Mumbles website. It is from this website that the video and visuals are based. On Saturday the 27th of January 1883, the village of Mumbles had awoken to what the Cambrian newspaper referred to as the Great Storm, and the news of a dreadful loss of life in Port Einan Bay. At about 4:30 a.m. the steamer Agnes Jack, which was bound for Llanelli with a cargo of iron ore, lost her way in the storm and had struck rocks off Port Einan Head. Her crew of 17 and pilot, Philip Baynon, were drowned. At the light of dawn, 3 men hurried up Mumbles Hill to look out for any other ships in distress. As they looked through the rain and mist, they saw 2 vessels were battling the winds and rough seas, one towing the other, probably heading for Swansea Bay. Bristol Channel vessels had to watch out for the treacherous Mixon sandbank, the Cherry Stone rocks, and once inside the bay, the Green Grounds, an ancient submerged foreshore which at low tide could catch out a ship's master. The 3 men on Mumbles Hill were members of the Mumbles Lifeboat crew, coxswain Jenkins, John Williams, and William Rosser, all oyster dredgers. It soon became clear to them that the ship was in great trouble. Her tow had parted and, as Jenkins later reported, she was making for land under no control. On Mumbles Lighthouse Island, lighthouse keeper Abraham Ace was on watch. He later recounted that at about 9 o'clock he saw a ship coming up the channel, apparently unmanageable, with a tug playing about her. He realized the vessel was not attached to a tow and was drifting in the strong winds towards the shore. He was sure the ship would strike the Mixon or the rocks. The ship in distress that Saturday morning was a German 3-masted wooden bark, Admiral Prinz Adalbert. The bark, with her master and crew of 15, was on her way from Rochefort in France to Swansea with a 900-ton consignment of pitwood for timber merchant, Mr. James Davies. Swansea tug, Flying Scud, emerged out of the rain and mist. Captain Leibauer was grateful for the skipper's offer to help his ship into Swansea Bay. It was common for Swansea tugs to cruise around looking for work, particularly in bad weather. It was known as seeking to or dodging. Flying Scud was a steam paddle tug built at Neath Abbey Ironworks in 1877 and owned by Rosser of Swansea, who for a time owned more tugs than anyone else in the town. Flying Scud's skipper, William Harvey, offered to show Captain Leibauer the course for Swansea. It was soon clear that the weather was too bad to do this, and when Harvey suggested towing the bark into port, for a large sum, a fee of £500 was requested, Captain Leibauer had no alternative but to accept. After an hour's towing in rough seas, the ship's hawser broke. The same thing happened when a second tow was tried. The Flying Scud did not have a hawser strong or long enough for such weather conditions, so she headed off to alert the Mumbles Coast Guard. Captain Leibauer desperately put down anchors, but the cables parted. The bark, now close to Limeslade Bay, was drifting helplessly towards Broadslade, Bracelet. Soon after, blown by the gale, she went aground on the Lighthouse Island rocks. The entry in the RNLI's logbook for the 27th of January 1883 records the launch of the lifeboat stationed at Mumbles to the bark Admiral Prinz Adalbert of Danzig aground on a side of Mumbles Lighthouse in south-southwest heavy gale, high sea. The lifeboat Wolverhampton, named after the Midlands town that so proudly raised the money to buy her in 1866, launched at 10 o'clock, just as the bark went aground. Coxswain Jenkins, his 4 sons, second coxswain John, William, George and Jenkins Jr., son-in-law William McNamara and nephew John Williams, were in the crew along with George Davies, Thomas Michael, David John Morgan, William Rogers, William Rosser and John Thomas, 13 men in all. Villagers climbed up Mumbles Hill, and from this vantage point they watched the lifeboat pulled through the turbulent sea of the inner sound by her 10 oarsmen. The bark became stuck fast on the rocks with waves breaking over her. The Wolverhampton was about 30 yards from the bark when coxswain Jenkins shouted, "Let go, Johnny." Bowman John Williams dropped the lifeboat's anchor and did his best to keep the boat in position in winds he later described as blowing a perfect gale. A line was thrown from the bark to the lifeboat and another attached. The villagers on Mumbles Hill watched 2 sailors hauled by this means from the shipwreck to the lifeboat, which was tossing in the waves, her crew using their oars to keep her in position. Then, to their horror, as a third man took his turn, a huge wave broke over the lifeboat and she capsized, throwing most of the men in her overboard. In the rough seas around Mumbles Head, the lifeboat crew were dashed against the wrecked ship and jagged rocks. John Williams was badly bruised when he was thrown onto the bark's deck, but this saved his life. John Thomas tried to swim in icy seas towards the tug Flying Scud, hovering nearby. When he saw that the lifeboat had been righted, he managed to scramble aboard, where he found William Rosser, Coxswain Jenkins, and his eldest son John. Together they managed to pull aboard William McNamara, who was in a bad way. Then the lifeboat capsized again. A Cambrian newspaper reporter described villagers on the hill being in an anguish of despair, tearing their hair and the grass on the ground as they saw the Wolverhampton driven towards the outer sound, capsizing and righting until all her crew was swept overboard and she eventually disappeared from view. Once in the calmer waters of Swansea Bay, she was taken in tow by a tug. The two sailors rescued from the bark were still aboard her. As he was swept towards the middle island, Coxswain Jenkins heard above the roar of the storm his son, John, cry, "It is all over with us, father, my head is cut open." The badly injured coxswain managed to pull John ashore, but he was dead. He could only hope that the rest of the crew, including his 3 other sons and his daughter Sarah's husband, William McNamara, were safe. Looking across the outer sound, he witnessed John Thomas and William Rosser being hauled ashore by 2 of Abraham Ace's daughters and 1 of artillerymen stationed at the island's fort. Out of the coxswain's sight, his sons George and Jenkin, despite their severe injuries, managed to swim into Bob's cave below the lighthouse. Here they were found a few hours later by Abraham Ace. At low tide, the remaining crew of Admiral Prince Adalbert scrambled onto the island. Peter Ralberg, the vessel's carpenter, had drowned when the lifeboat capsized, and his body, along with those of John and William Jenkins, was brought ashore that afternoon. William McNamara's remains were washed up 2 weeks later, but William Rosser's body was never found. Mumbles had lost 4 gallant men, including 2 of the coxswain's sons and his son-in-law. This disaster made 4 women widows and 19 fatherless children. Every man in the lifeboat crew was someone's husband, father, son, grandson, nephew or cousin, and known to everyone in the village. Mumbles was stunned. They censured the captains of the tugs Flying Scud and Flying Cloud for not assisting the rescue, and owner of the former for not having proper tow ropes on board. Everything was done that was possible by the lifeboat crew, and their gallant conduct was beyond all praise. A few days after the disaster, the members of the Lifeboat Branch Committee met at Swansea Town Hall. The minutes record the committee's desire to express their admiration of the conduct of the lifeboat crew on the occasion of the wreck of the Prussian bark Admiral Prince Adalbert. The committee deplored that this gallant service was not performed without loss of life to 4 members of the crew, John Jenkins, William Jenkins, William McNamara, and William Rogers, whose widows and orphans the committee feels the deepest sympathy for, and also with Jenkin Jenkins, coxswain, Jenkin Jenkins Jr. and George Jenkins, who were severely injured. Everything was done that was possible by the lifeboat crew, and their gallant conduct was beyond all praise. The INLI contributed £800 to the public appeal set up by the Mayor of Swansea to raise the £3,000 deemed necessary to support the bereaved families. The Vicar of All Saints chaired a meeting in the church schoolroom when £170 was immediately collected, with a further £300 donated. Numerous local events raised more money. The disaster that befell the Mumbles Lifeboat and her crew had an additional aspect: the saving of 2 men's lives by the bravery of 2 young women who became national heroines. 22-year-old Jessie Ace and her older married sister Margaret Wright, daughters of the Mumbles lighthouse keeper, who lived on the lighthouse island. Local newspapers recounting the disaster described how they tied their shawls together to throw to a lifeboatman, then waded into the outer sound to help him ashore. At the inquest, William Rosser agreed the girls had thrown him a rope, and John Thomas confirmed his rescue by Gunner Hutchings. The story, which soon caught the British public's imagination, was picked up by national press and local newspapers all over the country. The graphic printed a dramatic etching. Photographs of the sisters were sold to raise money, and the Times reported that Queen Victoria had won The story of Jessie and Margaret was embellished and immortalized by the influential Daily Telegraph theatre critic and writer, Clement Scott, in his poem, The Women of Mumbles Head. 5 years later, in 1888, a set of 8 lantern slides was produced to accompany public performances of the poem. Jenkins was awarded an RNLI Silver Medal plus £50 in recognition of his gallant conduct and severe injuries. Each crew member received £5 with an additional £10 for the 2 most seriously injured. The thanks of the institution inscribed on vellum plus £2 were awarded to Gunnar Hutchings. The Emperor and Empress of Germany sent a medal to Jenkins, generous gifts of money to the 4 widows and surviving lifeboat crew, and mementos to the lighthouse keeper's 2 daughters. On the 10th of October 1891, the world's first ever charity street collection was held in Manchester to raise money for the RNLI. It was the first Lifeboat Saturday, a milestone event that shaped future fundraising.